I'm Devona Walker with the Oklahoman. I'm a reporter here, and I'm sitting here having a conversation with Bruce Fisher, the curator of the African American exhibit at the Oklahoma History Center. Hi, Bruce.
Hi.
So I guess I'd like to begin with just asking you about your own experiences in the civil rights movement. I understand your mother was pretty involved in a different area of the civil rights movement. You want to just explain that?
Well, the civil rights movement in Oklahoma has a long, long history. It dates back from the inception of the state. The very first bill passed in Oklahoma was a bill to set up segregation in Oklahoma. So Senate Bill number 1, from that point on, it's been a struggle of African Americans to regain all of the rights guaranteed by the Constitution. And there have been many civil rights cases that are fought in segregation in housing, in residential areas, voting rights, anti-lynching, and virtually every aspect of life. There was been fights for the rights of African Americans. Yes, it's true. My mother was instrumental in changing the face of segregation in Oklahoma, because she was the first African American to apply to be admitted to the University of Oklahoma's law school in 1946, when segregation was fully in place in Oklahoma. And as a result of a Supreme Court decision, she and many other students were admitted to the University of Oklahoma. And that was in 1948, was when the Supreme Court made their ruling. The first African American to walk on campus was George McLaurin in 1949, and my mother in 48, and my mother came in 1949. She graduated in 52, and she was later appointed to the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma. So she went from all the way from being denied admission to being on the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma.
About 8 years ago, you came to the Oklahoma History Center. Is that correct?
About 8 years ago, I joined the Historical Society, and at the time they were planning for the construction of the new History Center, the new building, and asked if I was interested in being the team leader for the development of the African American exhibit area, and I said absolutely. And so we started collecting the artifacts and collecting the stories to be able to talk about the contributions of African Americans to the growth and development of our state. And most of what you see when you come to the exhibit, most of what you find in the way of artifacts are things that have been donated since the inception of this project. We did not have in our collection at the Historical Society the artifacts to tell the story. And in most history books, they didn't include most of our story either. That's why I asked you the question earlier about where you went to high school, and did you learn about the civil rights movement in high school? Because the story of African Americans has not been incorporated into the mainstream history of our state or our nation, which is why we feel that this year is so important that we take this opportunity to celebrate this important milestone in African American history.
If you look back at the lunch counter protest itself, they began at Katz Drugstore, and they also went to several other restaurants, which some of them might have been just locally, individually owned, but I think there were several chains. And I was wondering if you remember if that was intentional or not, because, you know, I know that there's such a thing called the Southern Bloc. So, for instance, if you can integrate Katz Drugstore in Oklahoma City, that would actually force management to integrate all of Katz Drugstores. But do you know if that wasn't like intentional at that time, that people were thinking about that?
I don't know what the strategy was behind which places to attack and which ones that they thought would make the biggest impact. I don't know what the strategy was behind that. But I do know that the corporate office of Katz Drugstore was unaware that they were segregating the seating and the accommodations for African Americans in Oklahoma. I do know that from looking at the newspaper articles that came from the Daily Oklahoman that reported on this incident. And incidentally, the first name for the sit-in movement was not sit-ins, it was store sitters. Store sitters. That was the report that came out in the Daily Oklahoman about 3 days after the sit-in began. They called it store sitters, and they mentioned in that article that the corporate office of Katz was unaware that they were doing in Oklahoma, and of course they immediately moved to change their policy. But you know, remember that what happened in the South was not what happened in the North, and whether they were chain stores or whether they were individual stores, I would imagine that the chain stores were more, just like in the case of Katz, were much more willing to make the change and make it quickly than some of the privately owned stores. You see, segregation was such a horrible experience based on misinformation about African Americans. Remember that our law, Senate Bill number 1, passed 1907. The day we became a state, the very first bill passed was to implement segregation. But that came as a result of all of the misinformation that precluded the education about the human beings, the humanity of African Americans. We were just a few years out of slavery, a few decades out of slavery. And so the whole idea that people of African descent were somehow different from other people was a huge misinformation that had filtered into every aspect of our society.
Okay, when we're looking specifically at the lunch counter itself, which what you've done is basically replicated the original Cat's drugstore lunch counter, where the students, the kids at the time, were actually trying to get to eat at. And along with that, I know that there's a really nice video presentation that you put on, as well as some monuments of the original protesters and whatnot. And how did that process come to pass? I mean, go ahead.
Well, museums give us an opportunity to interpret different aspects of our history, and we knew we wanted to talk about the civil rights movement in Oklahoma, and we thought that what happened on August of 1958 was such an important turning point for our state that we wanted to use that as one of those milestones in the civil rights movement. Many times I've been in the exhibit and be walking through it or something and notice people standing there watching the video, and then I'll hear them say, "There I am." They see themselves on that video. And it's I've been there many times where Miss Lupa has actually been up there, and she'll come up there and sit at the lunch counter and look at the video, and people come by and see her, and when the whole place just comes to a standstill with people wanting to have photographs of her and that kind of thing. So it's a representation of the original lunch counter, not the real one, but a representation of that original lunch counter.
Why isn't it taught as part of Oklahoma history? I mean, it's pretty significant turn of events for Oklahoma history, or not even if you're looking at it from like the perspective of Black history, but just for state history. I mean, has there been any movement in trying to incorporate that into the curriculums in the Oklahoma schools at all?
I have no knowledge of that. I would hope that one of the things that I used to really talk about when I was giving tours at the History Center and everything. I said, wow, for the very first time, what we have at the History Center, the whole African American exhibit there that talks about the contributions of African Americans in sports, in business, in education, in culture, in court cases, in medical practitioners, the whole thing. I was awful excited when I was thinking about the fact that for the very first time in our state, that African Americans can come to the Oklahoma History Center and see our exhibit. And I thought that was a real big deal. But what I've also become to appreciate is, for the first time, thousands and thousands of white students that come will learn of the contributions of African Americans. Right. So I hope that eventually makes its way into our state curriculum, but I don't have any first-hand knowledge of how that might happen.
Okay, so on August 19th, between 9:30 and 10:30, there's going to be a special tribute to Clara Luper, the original protesters, as well as like the sit-in movement.
Right.
And it's going to be the Oklahoma History Center, and everyone's invited to come down.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.